In fact, there are Shadim Torah scholars. Their halakha is different from ours. Saying that there are some monstrous actors doesn't take away from the fact that they're not evil. And that's really important when you think about how to deal with them. By the way, it's important to how we think about people too, right? Somebody can be monstrous without being evil. And so the point here is that this is a Jewish approach to Jewish monster hunting, right? Avoid trouble, talk first, and take action when necessary. So let's jump in. We're going to start with Shadim. One thing that you'll hear me, that I say on my podcast a lot, that I'll comment right now, is Jews are wonderful at commentary. We're terrible at taxonomy. Every comment that I'm going to make has been argued at least 3 times with different definitions. So if anybody wants to say, wait, please raise your hand. We'll get into it, right? Because there's at least 5 different ways of doing this. There are multiple names for demons. We're going to start with the most common one, which is Shadim. Shadim are everywhere, according to our law. According to the Talmud and the Mishnah, Shadim are real. They're external, right? They're not just in our heads, and they're everywhere. They're physical creatures. There are thousands of them around them. Now, we don't see them, right? They're typically invisible, but they're not always invisible. The Talmud also talks about ways in which they are similar to us and similar to angels. Again, presumption, angels, demons, quite literally, factually, externally real. Like humans, they eat and drink, they multiply and have children, and they die. Demons have a life cycle. Like ministering angels, they have wings, they can fly from one end of the world to the other, and they know what will be happening in the future. By the way, they know what's going to happen in the future in the same way angels do, which is they cheat. Because they are in heaven, they can listen through the curtain, as it were, and hear God talking about what's happened. They don't actually have direct knowledge, but they're a lot better than us, right? So just like angels, demons know what's to come. According to Jewish lore, there are lots of different stories about where Shadim come from. We could be here all day for an hour just talking about the different stories about where they come from, but we're not going to do that. I'm going to give you a quick highlight of the 4 most common. One, and this comes from Pirkei Avot, they were created at twilight, right before the first Shabbat. There's a list of 10 things that were created right before twilight, and Shadim are one of them. This is very important to Shadim lore because they were unfinished by intention. While we live in a physical world, we are fixed in form, and God lives in a world that has no form. Angels and demons live in a world that's unformed, that they can change shape. They can look however they want to look, with a key exception, which I'll get to in a moment about demons. The second is that Shadim are the spirits of the evil dead from the great flood. Noah survived and his family, the rest did not. God had wiped out the earth. What happened to all of these evil people? They became Shadim. Third, they come from the unfinished corner. There's a great midrash that says God left one corner of the earth unfinished so that if anybody else comes to say that they are actually God, we can look to them and say, finish it. And when they can't, we'll know that they were not. And that is to the north of where cold winds come from, and that is where Shadim come from. And the last, this is actually my favorite of them, that they are the children of Adam and Lilith, we'll talk about Lilith in a moment, and Eve and Samael. I won't get as much into Samael, but think demons. Samael is actually an evil angel, but there's a great midrash that for 130 years after the death of Cain, Adam and Eve were estranged from each other, and boy, did they both get busy over that time period. They had lots of children over that time period, and that's where the demons come from. Okay? So Lilith. So who is this Lilith demon queen? Lilith is Adam's first wife. If you read the Torah the way the rabbis do, rabbis were always looking for things that don't sound quite right next to each other. And one of the classic ones is that there are 2 discussions in Genesis of creation, and Adam's first wife, whatever you want to name her, is described twice. To the rabbis, clearly that meant they were 2 different people. The second one, Eve, was created of Adam's bone. The first one, Lilith, was created out of dust, same as Adam. Adam and Lilith were created together to be partners, and it didn't go well. They fought and argued, and Lilith, who refused to be dominated by Adam, who assumed that he was going to be in charge. It's actually not clear why Adam thought he was going to be in charge. God didn't say that, but guys, we do. So she flees. Adam complains to God. God sends angels after her, and the angels say, you have to come back. And Lilith says, I absolutely refuse. I would rather become a Shaddim. I would rather be the queen of Shaddim. I would rather spend eternity killing Adam's children than go back with that jerk. And the angel said, fine, deal, done. And they struck a bargain that would be the case. The only little caveat to make sure that Adam's children did not go extinct was that anybody who hung an amulet with the names of those angels would be protected. Hence, a long tradition of anti-Lilith amulets that have been part of the Jewish community. I have 2 examples right here, just to grab, if I can do this without knocking everything over. So this one comes from a medieval book of Jewish magic called the Sefer Raziel. This one gets reprinted often. This one came from Eichler's, a Jewish bookstore in New York. And you can buy it online for about $3. The idea hasn't changed. Okay? It's also very important to know in Jewish lore, while Lilith is a horror show, she also can be tricked. She is not only amulets, there are wonderful stories of clever midwives tricking Lilith to get her to stay away. Ashmedai. Ashmedai is one of the kings of demons. According to some lore, he is Lilith's husband. He is a shape-changing trickster. He is also, in some later midrash, described as a good-humored Torah scholar. Great. We have this savage, horrible demon who studies in yeshiva, right? That is that sense of like halakha for demons is maybe a little different. One of the classic stories is of King Solomon, who needs to build the temple, but he is under a specific rule that you can't build the temple with regular tools that would cut stone, and he doesn't know how to handle that, and so he summons, using a magic ring given to him by an angel, he summons Ashmedai, who points him to the Shamir worm, which is the worm, according to Midrash, that can cut stone by itself. It just kind of trucks along and cuts the stone. And there's this huge set of legends about the rivalry between Ashmedai and King Solomon, which again, we could spend hours talking about some of those stories. And there are lots and lots of stories about both Ashmedai and Lilith. Another demon, one of my favorites. By the way, I'm not just going to catalog demons. We're going to get to the monster hunting part in a second. But Joseph Hasheda, otherwise known as Joe the Demon, this is one of my personal favorites. He was a Torah scholar. According to the Talmud, there are places in the Talmud where the rabbis who wrote the Talmud summon him to ask clarifying questions. And if that's not the most Jewish thing I could think of, I don't know what is. There were some great discussions about how you could get from one place to another across Shabbat when you're not supposed to travel. Like there's great arguments that go on. Joseph is probably not his real name. That's what the rabbis refer to him as. It's probably something other than that, but that's what we know him by. And if you know the story of the golem, which again, we're not going to have time to really get into, a golem is a humanoid creature it's created by rabbis. In the story of the Golem of Prague, there's always a lot, 1,000 years of other golem stories. There's always a spirit that's required. The whole idea of you're just creating something out of mud isn't quite accurate. A spirit needs to go in, and Joseph the demon was the spirit that was used for the Golem of Prague because he was a friend to the Jews. Sarim, goat demons. Yeah, we have goat demons too. They're a little more obscure. These are hairy beings that are worshipped by the Israelites. They're referred to in Isaiah along with Lilith. And we mostly know about them because Jews kept getting yelled at for worshiping them. But the prophets kept getting mad at Jews. You should, by the way, when you read the prophets, every time the prophets get mad, you should take notes because that's what our ancestors were doing, right? So anytime they get mad at you for something, or like we were doing that. So that's how we know that Jews or Hebrews at one point were worshiping the goat Shaddim. And one of the stories of where they came from, how they're created, is that they were the spirits of the people at the Tower of Babel. What happened to them after they dispersed was they were sentenced to become Shadims. Just a couple more demons. We're going to go through this quick, then we're going to get to the monster hunting part. Lantuch. This is more from Eastern European and Ashkenazi lore. These are children of Adam and female Shadims. They're pranksters. They're people who kind of live in the shadows and love to torment people, pulling braids, knocking off hats. Great Ashkenazi story of a Lantuch who lay down in the middle of a street looking like a deer or a cow, depending on the story, and then when a farmer with a cart sees this sick animal, puts it in the back, only to find the animal like jumps up and starts dancing around and runs off and scares the hat off of him. Ruach Raha. So I've been using the term Shadim to refer to demons. I already said that's not quite right. There's multiple kinds, not just specific subcategories. So a Shadim refers to a specific kind of demon, at least according to Rashi. A Ruach is different. A Ruach is more of an unformed spirit. So where Shadim kind of have bodies, at least when they want to, Ruachs don't. The interesting thing about Ruach Racha is if you look at Jewish liturgy, not Reformed so much, because we don't do this typically, but certainly in the Orthodox and Hasidic world, it's the only demon that's left as part of liturgy. There's a observance that's part of Orthodox Judaism to wash your hands first thing in the morning, and it's because there's this idea that your spirit leaves your body, it goes up to heaven, and it comes back, but while your spirit is gone, the Ruach Raha can inhabit your body and taint it, and you want to wash to get rid of any lingering essence. There's a great article that I read not long ago, kind of walking through how it is the last of the demons in the Jewish liturgy. So here's a couple of others, demons that I like. So the Lilin, Lilith's children, both male and female, succubi and incubi, seducers. Shibribri, which is a demon of blindness from the Talmud, which can be defeated by saying his name. Shibribri, Bribri, Ri. Like there's this whole formula about how this works. The Shomer Dafim, the guardian of the pages, which is sometimes described as like an evil angel or a demon, that if you leave a book, particularly a holy book, open and walk away, that's a really bad thing and you're going to get punished, usually by forgetting what you just learned. And if that doesn't sound like a punishment to you, it was to the rabbis, right? Memorization is and study is a huge value in the Jewish community, particularly predating when you can look up the Talmud reference on your phone on sefaria.org like I do constantly. When you don't have that, not being able to learn and remember things is about as big a penalty as you can get. And then last, what Alice referred to, Bar Sharika Panda, the outhouse demon, which can be fought off with leeks and the jawbone of an ass. There's multiple discussions in the Talmud about the fact that Shadim live in wastelands and places where people don't want to be, including outhouses, so be very careful. There was one rabbi, I forget which one at this point, whose wife made him go to the privy with a sheep, or a lamb, just to protect him. Took this very seriously. Okay, one other set of critters that I want to describe, and then we're going to move on to the protective techniques. Werewolves and estries. So Judaism, when you see werewolves in horror movies, you should understand those actually come from Jewish lore. Werewolves are a kind of demon or a cursed man. An estry is the female equivalent. They are both people who have been cursed to be shape changers and have kind of gone feral. Where in the case of the guy, it's a wolf. The women can turn into kind of whatever they want, the most characteristically cats, and often there's a lot of stories, including one that if you come back tonight, I'm going to tell a classic estry story tonight. And estries are people who can turn into, they can fly, they're strong. They're not hard to defeat in the typical Jewish monster set. Like this is not a superpowered thing. The easiest way to defeat an estry is to get her to tie up her hair. So a good Jewish monster hunter always keeps some twine handy. Scrunchies will do just fine, presumably. And killing them is not hard, but there's a moral culpability that goes along with it because often they are cursed. So there's another part of the lore that says if you hurt an estry, you can also heal the estry by giving the estry your own bread and salt But be careful, if you have done that, you are now morally culpable if they go kill somebody else. Not an easy decision on what to do. If they have killed somebody and they are killed and they are buried, they will come back unless you bury them with rocks in their mouths. That's the charm to keep them from coming back. So our Jewish Lord doesn't make this easy on us, and it shouldn't. Okay, so let's talk about, now that we've kind of set the stage of some of the critters or things that we should be worried about out there, let's talk about basic defense techniques against Shadim. There are lots. Go figure, our community has been worried about this for over 2,000 years. We have lots of stuff. So the first is common sense. Please just stay away. Nobody should listen to this talk and say, hey, I want to go out and go be a Jewish monster hunter. This is a really bad idea. Be wary of bathroom cellars, graveyards, ruins, blight, wastelands. These are places that outside of civilization that we are in their territory. Sounds a little bit like wolves and bears. Yeah, kind of. And also, the rabbis say, just don't think about them, and they won't think about us. If we keep our worlds separate, then we're good. Okay, fine. But what if you're actually faced with them? Then there are three specific classes of techniques. So the first is to deceive them. Typically, Shadim are jealous and angry and want us to be miserable, and if we pretend we're miserable, we can stay out of their radar. By the way, I'll talk about the evil eye in a little bit. This is very similar to the evil eye. And so how do we convince them that we are miserable? We cry, we wail, we wear dirty or torn clothing, we be humble. By the way, this is still part of the Jewish community. Again, not so much in the Reform community, but if you hang out with any Hasids and you ask them how they're doing, they will never say, I'm okay. What they're going to say typically is Baruch Hashem, praise God, which can be taken a lot of ways, right? Because you don't want to attract attention. You don't go up to parents of a newborn and say, what a beautiful child you have. You are asking for trouble by doing that. The classic, and this may raise a few eyebrows in the room, the classic place this is still part of the Jewish community is when you step on a glass at a wedding. Now, I understand all of you have been told a dozen other reasons why we step on glasses at a wedding. All of those stories, all of those things are not wrong, but they have been added on to a much older tradition. At weddings, we step on glasses as a way to say, hey, yeah, we got this festive thing going, but look, hey, we just broke a glass. It's not that good. And there's usually historically other things that would go along with it. It was also tradition to pay a woman to cry at a wedding, right? There were things that you would do in a classic, I'm talking 500, 800 years ago, Jewish wedding, to help balance the scale between it being a festive day and it being mournful as a way to not attract attention of the Shadim. So deceive them. That's a good strategy, easy to get us to get our head around. Second is bribe them. Okay? Shadim love jam. We all, I don't know that everybody here knows this. I hope a few people know this. Keep jam. I always keep a few things of jam on hand, just in case. But the important thing, because again, we're Jewish, we're monotheistic, we have to be very careful with the bribe strategy, right? I'm not suggesting that we go and worship the Shadim. I'm not saying we should fawn on the Shadim. We're hanging out. Come on, come over for a cup of coffee. Let's get to know each other, and that's a good thing. But we never want to kind of create a tone that we are somehow subservient to them, because that is absolutely, absolutely forbidden. By the way, if we go back to the things that the prophets have yelled us for about, is because we go over that line. Jews are known for accidentally charging right over that line. So just a warning, don't do that. And also, the bribery is usually best with the lesser powerful demons. You're not going to get very far offering Lilith jam. That's not going to go well. Just saying. There are other demons. So half Shadim, the Banim Shoshubim, the Shledali, which are elves like the Lantuk. The Lantuk I mentioned, you're in much safer territory if you're trying to bribe those guys. Because, hey, you're a Lantuk, you're hanging out, you're scaring people, you're going to give me some butter and some oatmeal? That sounds good. We're cool. Okay, the last is fight. Don't recommend this, but sometimes you got to. So the basic fighting tactics, more aggressive type tactics, are really aimed at scaring away or chasing Shadim. Noise, torches, salt, iron, things that feel aggressive. carry torches and candlelights, blow shofars, have things that are very strongly smelled, tobacco, sulfur. So a lot of my gear is around that. So I always have sulfur on hand. Just as an example, keep a pipe handy. Pipe, by the way, is very important for other things. This is my little pride and joy. This is my iron-tipped, silver-headed walking stick. There are, believe it or not, there are dozens and dozens of stories from the medieval and early modern period of rabbis with magic walking sticks that fit this basic characteristic. One of the cool things about this one is it has a tube and it's kind of hard to get out. All right, you'll have to show it to you later. I carry a mezuzah in this. According to the Talmud, this was a very standard technique, which is to have a walking stick with a mezuzah in it as a mechanism of protection. Okay. All right, so that's some of the basic techniques for shadim. I want to kind of expand this, talk about ghosts and dibbiks just for a moment, because they've got their own special handling. So first, so that we're all on the same page, and we could talk about dibbikim for hours. Dibbikim is spirit possession. It really comes out of the Kabbalah and an idea about Gilgul, that people can be reincarnated in their own bodies, and that can go wrong if you are not worthy of having that process happen. Your spirit can be abandoned, and if your spirit is abandoned, then you will become a dibbik and take over somebody else's body. For the sociologists in the room, just to be clear, this is not fiction or folklore. This is documented fact. We have, in the sense that we have reports of dibbik possession going back at least to the late 1500s. These are like broadsheets from Safad and other things where people have said, there's a person in my town who was just possessed by a dibbik. Now, we can talk about whether it's a psychological phenomenon or a supernatural phenomenon, but this is not, again, not campfire stories. Dibbik possession stories never ended. They still happen, and again, spoiler for tonight, if you come tonight, I will tell a dibbik story from 1994, okay? So they are, okay, that's the idea of dibbiks. Dibbiks, you can do an exorcism on dibbiks. I will put the classic safety tip for all Jewish exorcisms. Unlike the Catholic-oriented horror movies that you will see, Jewish exorcisms don't always go well. Okay? Catholic priests seem to always win, and if you read like the stories of Jewish rabbis doing exorcisms, they're pretty good. They're pretty good, but they don't always win. There's a theme of, hey, local Baal Shem. A Baal Shem is like a wandering wonder rabbi, tries to do an exorcism, doesn't go well, have to call for the big guns from Lublin to come down and take care of that. And again, if you come tonight, I'll tell a story of one or two, depending on how much time we have, stories of Rabbi Yoel Baal Shem, who's like a known wonder rabbi. So the thing about Jewish exorcisms, and I've told, every time I start describing it, I have at least one social worker in the room. We're Jewish. There's got to be at least one social worker in the room who starts saying, that sounds like therapy. Yeah, it 100% sounds like therapy, right? Because the first thing that you need, the rabbi does is sits down, offers it tea, says, what's going on? What's troubling you? Like, how did we get into this mess? Like, clearly you don't want to be here. We don't want you here. What's going on? And that usually starts a dialogue, and if it ends well, that may be all that's necessary. There are classic Jewish stories of rabbis who've sat down with the dibbik and were able to just resolve it through their strength of character, their kavanah, their mystical intention, and their just general awesomeness, and it all ends. But exorcisms happen, and so I've got a list up there. It's maybe a little hard to read with the light, so I'll read it for you really quick. This is what a classic Jewish exorcism looks like. And for anybody who's that phrase is like, wait, there's such a thing as a classic Jewish exorcism? If you take nothing else from this talk, we do exorcisms too, all right? You purify yourself. You gather a minion. You interview the dibbik, like I just said. You do the therapy. You draw a circle. Okay, Jewish circle magic is a big deal. I'll mention it later. I'm always prepared. I always carry charcoal, pencils, and soapstone chalk, depending on the kind of surface you have to work with. These are both excellent for doing circle magic. Okay, you expose the dibbik to smoke or sulfur. I already showed you that. You recite the Dybbuk's name if possible. Part of the therapy is to get him to fess up of who was this jerk who just inhabited this body. Who were they really? You pray. Jews like to pray a lot. You say psalms, particularly Psalm 91. We'll talk about that in a minute. You use the shofar to make noise. Candles, amulets. These things we're talking about, they're very similar to Shadim. And then the most important thing is you need to have a place for them to go, right? So you want to keep a bottle handy. Otherwise, a Dybbuk may just leave that person's body and then go wandering around to get somebody else. And you don't want that. So typically, you'd want to have some kind of stoppable glass or lead jar. And then you need to be ready because when a Dybbuk comes out, it's kind of messy. It'll come out through some hole in the body, and you can use your own imagination as to which holes are the most preferred. Yes, the Jewish stories are pretty clear. Whatever you're imagining is probably what the stories are describing. We'll have a little decorum. So that is the general flow of all of this, okay? By the way, as a little side note, there is a ritual in Judaism that this is very similar to. It's not one that anyone in this room has ever seen, I would expect. There is a ritual of excommunication in Judaism, of forcing somebody unwillingly to no longer be Jewish. This is very similar to that kind of a thing. So, like when I talk about candles, black candles are the kinds of candles you'd be using here. So, okay, ghosts. Dybbuks are, like, almost by definition the bad guys. Ghosts are just us. So there's this whole other talk that I give on Jewish death lore, which is infinitely fascinating and interesting and not talked about, particularly in liberal Reform Judaism. According to the classic Jewish mindset, our soul, we have a soul or a spirit. It's actually three different parts: the neshama, the nefesh, and the ruach. And again, we're on a clock, so I can't get into all the details. But understand that when we say a ghost, what we're typically talking about is either the nefesh or the ruach. The nefesh hangs around the grave for a while, but then eventually moves on. But the ruach never does. The ruach stays with the body all the way until the world to come happens. And it is partly from the ruach that whatever spirit we're going to have in the future will come from. And that's what we're talking about ghosts. So the word ghost gets translated from nefesh or ruach. Okay? So there are lots and lots and lots of great Jewish ghost stories. Again, if anybody wants to come tonight, you might hear one. But the main protective tips are, number one, don't interact with them because they might try to encourage you to join them. That's not a good plan. Don't follow them. Don't follow the light. When you leave a graveyard, don't go straight home. Take a windy route. Go other places. You don't want the ghosts to know where you live. Again, you're trying to create this distance. Like Shadim and Dybbuks, they can be repelled with salt and iron and psalms, right? These are things that are generally understood as protective within the Jewish magic lore, and they work just fine for ghosts. And the last point I want to make is, just like we were talking about stepping on glasses for a wedding, I want to disabuse a few notions, at least expand on a few notions. When you go to a cemetery, when a Jew goes to a cemetery and we put a rock on a grave, yeah, you're going to hear a lot of explanations. Those all are fine, and they all build on what the original explanation was the rock was to help hold the ruach in place. You want your loved one who has moved on to stay right where they are. The graveyard is where they're supposed to be at this point. They're not supposed to follow you home. You were just there. Love you, Grandma. Please, just stay where you are. Okay. Evil eye. Again, you could do a whole multi-hours of talk about the evil eye, but we're just going to hit it in 2 slides. The evil eye is weaponized jealousy. It's that moment when you see somebody who has something that you can't have, who got something that you wanted. It is often not intentional, inadvertent, and we all do it. And according to both the Jewish mind, but also the Islamic, and to a lesser degree the Christian and other groups, evil eye is a worldwide phenomenon, not specifically Jewish, but absolutely Jewish. It kills. There, in the Talmud, specifically, there's a comment by one of the rabbis that 99% of the people in the graveyard are there because of the evil eye. That's what jerks people are, is we manage to kill off everybody around us through our own bad attitudes toward them. So what do you do about that? Well, first of all, you try to be humble, not call attention to yourself more than necessary. You don't attract the evil eye. And then you need to do a lot of different kinds of protection. There's thousands of years of protective magic approaches to counter the evil eye. Number one, and this one's one of mine, though I'm sure most people in the room are familiar with hamsas. In case you have seen them but haven't really looked at them carefully, they are representative of a hand, or a hand like this. They come in lots of forms. This is a Moroccan Jewish one. And they are all about protection from the evil eye. There are vocal and hand gesture kind of things that go along with it, and what specifically they are vary by your community. The Mizrahi, Sephardic, and Ashkenazi all have different versions of that. If anyone's seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, there's a moment where oh shoot, what's Tevye's wife's name? Goldie goes, "Doo, doo, doo," and makes a spitting noise. That was an anti-evil eye. That was specifically to not attract attention from, because something good was happening. Don't let anybody, think about this too hard. In the Mizrahi world, you would put up your hand and you'd say five, or there's a bunch of different kind of phrases that go along with the word five that you might say. There's a lot of different color and animal associations. So fish is a common symbol in Sephardic and Mizrahi anti-evil eye charms, because fish, their eyes are always open, but they live underwater and they can't be touched by the evil eye. So it's symbolic. The color blue is symbolic. There's a lot of these. But even that doesn't always work. And so what happens when somebody gets the evil eye or is attached to it? So this is less the case in Ashkenazi, though there's definitely a tradition of this, but in Sephardic and Mizrahi, whole medicine cabinets worth of different kinds of homespun charms that you would use, most commonly using cloves and lead and specific saying specific prayers that go along with them. And if anybody's interested, I could point you to examples and references on what those would look like in the Ashkenazi as well as the Sephardic community. By the way, I should note, I mentioned the Baal Shem a moment ago. Baal Shem are the wonder rabbis, and they're guys, right? We're talking about a time period where there are no women rabbis. There were no women Baal Shem. But I will also say that going all the way back to the Talmud, the rabbis were always kind of suspicious about women doing magic because they were doing magic all around. Most magic in the Jewish community is done by women. They're in the Ashkenazi world, there's a term babski refues, which is like old wives' cures. There are other similar terms in the Mizrahi and Sephardic communities. Every village had adult women who knew how to do these kinds of charms, how to make cordials, how to make different kinds of remedies, all coming out of the Jewish magic tradition. It was woven into the fabric of Jewish life really up until we emigrated to the United States. Mostly in the United States, it's gone, though not entirely. But huge, huge history of women's magic, just the same with women's prayer and women's spirituality. That is, anybody who's interested in that, I can point you to references on that. Okay, kind of moving along. Amulets. Talking about a few other things, so we start wrapping up. So an amulet is typically a name of God. So big part of Jewish magic is different uses of various names for God. There's an infinite number of names that God gets used in Jewish magic tradition, written down often with a fragment of Talmud or of Torah or of Tanakh, with some additional language for what's needed. The amulet. So I held up an example of an amulet. The amulet is the writing on the parchment. It's not the parchment itself. That's the parchment could be replaced by anything. You could do an amulet on lead, on clay, on bone, on leaf, whatever. It's the text that matters. You use what you have at hand, and depending on how much effort you want to put into it. A Jewish scribe or rabbi who would make an amulet is probably going to use the same materials that would be used for a mezuzah, because that's what you typically have on hand, and it's considered kosher, and it lasts a while. But if you wanted to put a lot of effort into it, and you wanted to make a silver one or sketch one or scratch one into a gem, you could absolutely do that. But you can imagine it takes a lot more work. You got to be pretty serious about it. And long history of making amulets. Any Baal Shem or rabbi in the old world that would be part of their bag of tricks. And we've talked a little bit about anti-Lilith amulets. I already showed you a couple. Really quick story about the one on the left. About 5 years ago, I was in Jerusalem. The one time I've been to Israel, my older daughter was doing the Heller High program, which is part of the URJ. It's a semester abroad for high school juniors. If you happen to have kids or grandkids who are going to be juniors, you should absolutely check this program out. It's amazing. And I got to go on like a parents' week. And I ended up in one of the museums, the Hebrew Museum, I think, in Jerusalem, and they were along with a bunch of the other parents, and they were having one of their displays was on Jewish life cycle stuff. Birth, death, bris, weddings, all of this stuff. And I was standing there with a woman named Farah, who is an American Jew of Persian descent, and she started jumping up and down and waving her arms around, pointing to a amulet just very similar to the one that's on the left, going, "We have one of those. What is it?" And what she meant was her family had an amulet almost exactly like that. And when she had two daughters, one of whom was a high school junior, when she was ready to go into labor and delivery, her mother swooped in, gave her the amulet, and said, "When you are in labor and delivery, you hold this on your chest." And she did. And then when it was over and both her daughters were born healthy, she gave it back to her mother, who held on to it to hand to somebody else in the family. Farah never had any idea of what it was other than it was a family thing and her mom asked her to do it. It's not, from talking to her, it's not clear that her mother had any idea of what it was other than that's what her mother had asked her to do. And it just happened, I'm telling the story because I was standing next to her, right? And I said, "Do you know who Lilith is? Who's Lilith?" And I explain that this is an amulet. It's to protect the baby and the mother in the moment, a kind of great vulnerability from this demon queen. And all of a sudden, she's like, "Oh my God." She was like part of this multi-thousand-year tradition. She had no idea that what she was part of. And I don't want to say she all of a sudden believed in Lilith. And again, anybody in the room can make their own decision about what they do or don't believe in. And I'm not saying that Farah all of a sudden said, "Yep, there is absolutely Lilith out there, and I'm really terrified and glad this amulet worked." I'm not sure that she was thinking that. I don't think she was. But the fact that in her moment of great vulnerability, the Jewish community offered her this symbol of that, and that it helped her get through that was incredibly powerful to her. So we shouldn't forget the value of these kinds of things, whether or not we necessarily think that Lilith is out there to get us. Again, I'll leave everyone to their own conclusions about that. Along those lines, mezuzahs and tefillin are amulets. And anybody who tells you they're not is telling the truth, but the other truth is that they are. And this has been an active argument for 2,000 years about, are they protective in the sense of, hey, you do a mitzvah for God and God makes God's happy and that's the end of it? Or are they actually anti-demon charms that have this very functional, practical magic? And this is argued back and has been argued back and forth for 2,000 years. And clearly by the fact I've got a walking stick or I put a mezuzah in, you can get where I'm coming from on this. But there's a long history of people being very careful about their mezuzahs as a thing. And I had this funny discussion about this with Rabbi Josh Winston, who's the rabbi at Beth Emet, where I'm a member. And he was saying that a congregant came to him and said, "Hey, my son has got his first apartment. I really would like you to go hang the mezuzah for him. And, I want to make sure it's done right so it gets the right kind of protective power." And he was like, whoa. He's like, first of all, anybody can hang a mezuzah. You don't have to be a rabbi. The prayer is very, very simple, But if it makes you happy, I'm happy to go over to his apartment and do that. But Rabbi Josh, who's a good friend, he's like, not so in on it being a protective thing. And I remember I told him later, I'm like, I understand that you're not. If you ever have somebody ask you, then again, have me do it. I'll go do it, right? Because for a lot of Jews, for 2,000 years, that has been a true statement. And he can think whatever he wants, but that doesn't make the other side of the argument less powerful for the people who subscribe to it. So again, take that for what you will. I mentioned protective circles. The idea that drawing a circle on the ground, on a wall, creates a barrier. Again, this goes back thousands of years. There's a great story in the Talmud about Honi, the circle maker, who draws a circle and then calls for rain. That idea of circles didn't originate in that moment and didn't end in that moment. There is lots of Jewish lore and stories about protecting yourself and your family by drawing circles when necessary, or if you were really, really cocky and dumb, drawing a circle on the ground to summon a demon into, which is also part of Jewish magical lore, and I highly don't recommend trying to do that. It usually doesn't end well. Again, if you happen to come tonight, I'll tell a story where a circle gets drawn. I mentioned Segula and Percante really quickly. I don't know if I use the terms, but when I talked about Bobsky Refues and kitchen table magic, more than 2,000 year tradition of Jewish, typically women's home magic remedies. That's my little collection in the photo there. I think I've got a couple. So these are clove and lead that you would use in a anti-evil eye, but there's lots more that go as simple as how to use toothaches. By the way, I have a friendly back and forth with some folks who wrote a wonderful book on Ashkenazi herbalism. Recently, I actually got this wonderful message on Twitter from one of the guys I chat with on Twitter saying, hey, I was talking to the people who wrote that book, and they said they've gotten nothing but great reviews from the book except for one person. And he's like, by the way, that was you, right? And one person who said there wasn't enough magic and monsters in it. And the reason why that book is both wonderful and terrible is they don't want you to die, right? So they've created this book that is completely anachronistic. If you read their book, you're going to say, oh, wow, my great-grandmother was doing herbalism the way like someone in 2024 was doing herbalism. Oh, my God, that's so not true. It's a little bit true. There's nothing in the book that's not true, but it's just a part of this much wider spectrum of magical metal material. Like you can kind of see up in the top left, that's rabbit poop up in one of those jars. I've got wood shavings, right? The materials that would be used in these kind of charms and recipes are much, much broader than we might think of in terms of like contemporary herbalism. Again, I'm not necessarily advocating using the rabbit poop. That's probably not a good plan. But it was part of the tradition, okay? It's part of the tradition. We mentioned the evil eye. I think I've probably put the slide in the wrong spot. So we've already talked about this. We talked about perspective psalms a little bit. Psalm 91 is the most common one. One thing that you might not be aware of is that every psalm has a purpose from a Jewish magical perspective, and there are different references that talk about. So the Shemush Tefillin is one of them that I have, but there's different references on which psalm you use for which occasion, and protecting yourselves from demons is always Psalm 91. Because it has that great fear. You will not need to fear the terror at night, that phraseology, but there are psalms that you read if you want to get married. There's psalms that you read if somebody is sick. There's psalms you read if you're going to go on a trip. Like they all have these very concrete meanings and usages in traditional Jewish mind. Books of magic. So you've heard me, and everyone's good. No one's like waved their hand and said what when I've used the phrase Jewish magic tradition. We have a Jewish magic tradition. It's absolutely amazing. And there are absolutely, unequivocally Jewish spell books. Like if you imagine what like a spell book would look like, yeah, we have those that are part of the Jewish tradition. And some of them have played huge outsized roles in the evolution of Jewish thought. So the one that's up on the top left is Sefer Yetzirah. Sefer Yetzirah, according to tradition, was originally given to Adam by the angel Raziel. It talks about the zodiac, about gematria, which is how Hebrew letters have numerical values. It talks about the usages of names of God. I'm sorry, I'm reading Sefer Raziel Hamalek. So I'm getting them used. So as this falls over. So Sefer Raziel Hamalek goes to Adam. Hold still. So anyone wants to see what that looks like. Sefer Yetzirah, sorry, I'm getting wound up here. Sefer Yetzirah was given to Abraham, not to Adam. Sefer Yetzirah describes how God created the universe and the world by the usage of the Hebrew language. Okay? It is actually a deeply meditative text. It describes how to do Jewish meditation from a 2,000 year ago perspective, but it also weaves in how that use of Hebrew language in using this kind of a mindset was how God created the world. By the way, according to the golem lore, this is how you learn how to make a golem, is by mastering the text of the Sefer Yetzirah. So the whole idea of the golem, you've got this piece of clay, you kind of turns it people. This actually dates back to the Talmud and earlier, and in the era of the Talmud, it was kind of almost like your master's thesis. Oh, so you're like a tough rabbi, like you're really skilled. Have you made a golem yet? Come back when you did, right? There's this great scene in the Talmud where a rabbi has sent a golem to another rabbi to kind of show off, and the rabbi's like, "You're a golem. Go home and tell your master to try again." Because again, and this is a hill that I will absolutely die on. Golems look like people. They don't look like clay. They only look like clay when you were making them. It's sort of like telling me that a bunch of flour is a cake. I know what a cake looks like, and it's not the thing in the box, right? It's the cake. In the Talmud, rabbis would have golems for like a chicken golem or a lamb golem. You'd make a lamb golem, and they'd have it for Shabbat dinner. It didn't look like clay. It was you transformed the clay into flesh. That was the point of the exercise. Anyway, there are lots. The Sword of Moses, Sefer Ratzi Alamalek, there's lots of them. And they, like I said, some of them, Sefer Yetzirah in particular, have played an outsized role in the development of Judaism. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up, we've kind of talked about demons and estries and werewolves and lantuchs and all of this, and evil eye and ghosts and Dybbuk. These are all deeply part of Jewish lore. We've talked about ways in which Jews have thought about them and in a practical sense, in an at-home sense, have protected ourselves against them for millennia. And the thing I would note is it's worth a little study. It's worth a little understanding of where all that comes from. And keep your gearbox handy because you just might need it. So thank you very much. So before I walk off, I would love to take questions. I'm sure at least one thing that I said made somebody go, "Wait, what? Tell me that one again?" Or like, please, does anybody have any questions that I can answer? Please. Mm-hmm. Uh-huh, that's right. You're asking me, go ask them. I don't know. No, but seriously, no, it's for Jews. This is actually kind of a deep question. Unlike some other religions, our Christian friends in particular, who believe that if you don't do everything exactly the way Christians want, that you are somehow cursed, Judaism doesn't have that as an idea. There's this whole idea in Judaism that there's a basic set of rules, the rules that Noah was given, which are basically don't be a jerk, but it doesn't go that much deeper than that. Everybody's kind of held to that standard, but the Jews have a different standard that we have volunteered ourselves into, and that to fill in and mezuzah are things that come out of that very Jewish experience and very Jewish set of expectations. Other people don't have that expectation. So would it work for somebody else? I don't know the answer, but I would assume probably not. The whole original, if you go back to the original, one version of the original mezuzah was the lamb's blood put on the doorpost during the Exodus, right, to keep the angel of death, to let the angel of death know who the Jews were. The whole point of the mezuzah was to show who was a Jew and who wasn't. So my guess is no, but maybe I just talked myself into it because, hey, if they put lamb's blood up, if that's the only way the angel of death could tell and lamb's blood was on somebody else's door, I don't know. It's a great question. I'm not sure. Yeah, please. Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So it comes out of medieval French, and I don't know the etymologies of those two terms well enough to know whether the medieval French connects to it comes from Estrella, which was the medieval French version. Yeah, but I don't. It's a great question that I really don't know the linguistics to be able to answer, but it's definitely worth somebody thinking about or to start, for sure. Mm-hmm. 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 Sure, it's Turkish. I just forgot the name of it, but there are, yes. So as I said, the evil eye is often gets referred to by historians as being pre-Islamic. It predates Islam. It predates Christianity. It may even predate Judaism, but it's something that was embraced and absorbed by all three religions in their own way over time and with feedback back and forth. So Catholics will refer to a Hamsa as a hand of Fatima. I don't remember who Fatima is, but evidently that they made that connection along the way. So that the Nazair, I think it's Nazair, something like that is the Turkish version that you just described. There are a lot of Jews will use that as well, even though it kind of came out of Turkish Islam. Sir. Mm-hmm. 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 Sure. Yeah. So, first of all, those are wonderful books. I have not read them, but I have a couple friends of mine that keep yelling at me, mostly because I'm so behind in my fiction reading, because you should see, actually, you can, there's handouts. Did the handouts get printed? Oh, there are handouts, by the way. In my blog, there's a link, and I apologize, it's paper, so you have to retype it. But in my website, I have a kind of beginner's reading list on Jewish monsters and magic, some of which are articles and books, and I'm so tied up in all of that I'm way behind in my fiction. But that's not the crux of your question. But the idea that there are women who have engaged in amulet creation and engaged in these things at a professional level is something that she makes a claim about. I would certainly not argue that it's not true. The impression that I've gotten from most of my reading is that there were few women who were trained at the level required to do that women's magic tended to be the kitchen table variety, but the line between them is very, very fuzzy, and I have no trouble accepting her claims. I just don't have a lot of good examples to point you to saying, I'd love to be able to say, here's a text that she refers to that has a very specific example, and I'm not sure. I guess I really need to go read her book to. Hmm? Right. And I would have no reason to argue with that, particularly without having read her book. Read her books. Everything I've heard is that she's a first-rate scholar, and that I would generally accept. It would be my inclination to accept anything that she said. I'm certainly don't know enough to be able to pick a specific thing and say I disagree with that, and I don't know if you want to. Any other? Oh, Rabbi.
So I have a question regarding kind of the calendar, because as we know, in the Celtic tradition, and then by extension in the English-speaking Western world, Halloween became, the night
Mm-hmm.
of the ghosts. And I was wondering, what's the Jewish night of the ghosts? Like, can we even speak of the seasons where they're believed to be particularly active?
Um, that is great. The short answer to that question is yes, and I can give you a couple of different. There isn't a direct analog, but there are a couple of holidays that could tentatively make that claim. Number one is Hoshana Rabbah. That is definitely a night of spirits. Number two is actually Shavuot, which is coming up next week. Shavuot is less about spirits and more that a veil is being lifted between us and heaven, and that if you're going to make a prayer, that's the night to do it because that veil has been lifted. So I think those are the two that make the best claim, and Hoshana Rabbah being the primary. Quick call out, if any of you haven't seen the 1939 black and white movie, The Dybbuk, or seen the original Dybbuk play, you should absolutely do that. It is marvelous and holds up incredibly well, and all of the action in that is based around Hoshana Rabbah. So that's when a lot of the action takes place. Yeah,
So kind of like a follow-up question.
yeah.
I remember Hoshana Rabbah, Hoshana Rabbah in the temple was all about water, like the water drawing festival, and I noticed that some of the demons were called, B'nai Shovavim, which is like,
Mhm.
drawing of water. So what's the deal between demons and water? Because it's kind of like, if you look at Christianity or if you look at Islam, water is predominantly like a cleansing force. But in the Jewish tradition, water is very circumspect because demons can also always hide in water. So I'm like wondering, kind of like where's the water at in all of this?
So I have two answers. The first answer is I need to do some research because I don't. I'm about to speculate. But that's a really great question. I need to go do some more hunting on. My gut sense of it is in Judaism that we actually have almost more of an adversarial relationship with water than in other religions. If you look at how water is described in Genesis and at the midrash around Genesis, there's this idea of the water representing chaos and an adversarial force that God had to. Saying contend with is wrong because midrash never implies that it was all that hard, right? It wasn't like a real peer challenge, but that God had to wrestle with the water. With the Genesis talks about sea dragons, we're talking about Leviathan, which becomes kind of this representation of this adversarial force, and even there's a number of midrash around what's called the foundation stone, which is a real stone, which is in Jerusalem on the Temple Mount, and that stone, or depending on the midrash, the emerald underneath it, is a cork that God used to kind of hold down the original chaos waters. And so my off-the-cuff reaction is I think it's a representation of that lineage, but it's an awesome question, and I could be 100% off base on that. And so I really need to kind of think about that, or do some research about that. Yeah. Sure. Mhm. 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 So, yeah, I think there's a couple. Yeah, so I think here's my take on it. It didn't survive Judaism's encounter with modernity. If you look at starting in Germany, the Haskalah in the 1800s, there was this post-Renaissance rationalization that was happening in order that Jews could be just like Germans and just like the people around them. And in doing that, we had a tendency to push, and by we, I'm going to specifically say the Reform community at this point, wanting to the degree possible, marginalize anything that sounded like that, up to and including the phrase in the standard liturgy where we talk about, in the Tefillah section, where we refer to the Hametim versus Hakol, Hametim versus Hakol section. So I don't know about you guys, in my synagogue, about a third of us say Hakol, 2/3 say Hakol, and about 1/3 say Hametim, where this is discussion of God who brings people back to life, which is Hamay team, versus God who heals. And that fracture, which, by the way, is one of the few places where the Reformed community couldn't just push it aside and left both of them in there to the point where people say both of those things. I think that's where that fault line started of trying to marginalize as being part of modernity. And I also firmly believe, and this is just more of a personal observation that I'd love people to argue with, is that Judaism as a practicing culture was almost died and was recreated in the 1930s and 40s in the United States, American Judaism. It has very little in common with Eastern European or Persian or Sephardic Judaism because we wanted to be American so badly that we turned over our kind of the ownership of the religion to the synagogue, and the rabbis have done a great job, but they have little time and little focus, so they have little energy, so you focus on the liturgy and the key religious moments. But a lot of the stuff we're talking about are things that happen outside of the synagogue, and the rabbis are not the custodians of our home life. And I 100% agree. I 100% agree. My grandparents refused to teach my parents Yiddish. They would speak Yiddish behind my parents' back as a way to not have the kids understand, because they wanted their kids to be just like their neighbors. And that trauma, post-Shoah trauma, post-immigration trauma, combined with the Haskalah, I think that's where I think this comes. The thing that is, to me, really fascinating is the fact that I'm standing here talking to you now, the fact that Anton wrote her books not too long ago. There's a reason these things are happening now. There's an appetite in our community to bridge these gaps in many ways. The people who I talk to on the internet, I've got a modest Twitter feed, about 2,000 followers. I hate that term, followers, but people who track the Twitter, and I'm constantly having these conversations. And the people who I'm having who are responding to this are people who feel a little bit lost outside of the synagogue. They might have great synagogue experiences, but aren't really clear what to do at home, that are not okay with how rationalized the religion has become, who are trying to engage and feel their way into it, but it's all from a religious perspective. I mean, there are some people I talk to who probably also have a book of African and a book of Japanese folklore on their shelves and are just folklore nerds. But most of the people that I'm talking to, that's not where they're engaging me at. I very rarely get a question that says, hey, by the way, that thing that you just tweeted about, that's very similar to Celtic folklore. I mean, I get that, but maybe 1 out of 20 or 1 out of 30. All the other questions and things I get are people who are trying to build a life and trying to understand the world and feel like this stuff starts to answer certain questions that they feel need to be answered, which is, again, why it's so engaging and why I opened up mentioning Shalom Aleichem, right? Where I don't know this synagogue, but my synagogue, we sing that all the time, and very few people in my congregation, because I take informal polls occasionally, ever think about what that implies, right? It implies a belief that there are angels that will follow us home and watch over us. And to me, that's an incredibly deep and wonderful feeling. And whether the person who I'm talking to is, full on, I believe in God, or they're full on, I don't, or they're agnostic or anything, that sense that our religion wants us to feel sheltered is really powerful. And it's hard to talk about that if you can't also say it's a prayer about angels, because that's where it comes from. So, long answer. I should probably wrap up. Our family has a funeral that we need to go to in a little bit, and I want to give people a minute or two to come over and see my gearbox if anybody's so inclined before I pack it up. So maybe we'll stop here, and I'll take a couple questions over by the gearbox. Thank you, everyone.